Okay, so I guess before, have we started already, Denis? Oh, okay, so, all right, so the before we start is, that ship has sailed. Okay, so who in the room is actually already an Eclipse committer? Okay, so Doug, okay. Who has been a committer for more than 15 years? Anyway, sorry, Doug. All right, and who has contributed patches to an Eclipse project? All right. And has everybody got a Bugzilla account? Anyone not have a Bugzilla account? No Bugzilla account? Okay. I'm always impressed by, when I ask that question, how many people have never encountered a problem with Eclipse software. So that's, anyway, it's always encouraging. Anyway, welcome. So I'm here today to talk about, yes, please. I'm here today to talk about basically being a committer on an Eclipse project. And my name is Wayne Beaton. I'm the Director of Open Source Projects at the Eclipse Foundation. Part of my job is to maintain the Eclipse Development Process with the Eclipse Architecture Council. I'll talk a little bit about what that is, I think, later, if there's time. The Eclipse Architecture Council is actually the responsible body. They are the ones that decide how the development process evolves and changes. And I tend to be the author, and I work with them to maintain that document. We do try to update the process every once in a while to reflect the realities of what's going on in the world. And there's actually a new update that was going to be put before the board of directors in the middle of next month for approval. So starting in December, we'll have a few changes to our process. But I'll talk about those as we move forward. Okay, apparently I'm going to mumble to myself for a minute. Okay, apparently I have to click. All right, so I'm going to talk about basically what is an Eclipse project. I'll talk about the development process itself. A bit about working as a committer, talk about releases, which is probably the part of the Eclipse development process that you will engage in as a committer more often than anything else. A little bit about, just very briefly actually, about the project management interface. Make sure you're just aware that it's there and what it is, and sort of show you a few other things that you should know. We only have 35 minutes, so I can only get so far, so there's some exercises for the reader. So what is an Eclipse project? An Eclipse project is, we actually, as part of this recent update to the Eclipse development process, we decided to actually formalize the list of terms, a list of terms in the document, which seems so many years later like an interesting sort of thing to finally put in. But as part of that, coming up with an actual concise definition of what an open source project is surprisingly difficult. Basically, it is the primary operating unit of open source at the Eclipse Foundation. It's kind of an organizational unit. Projects have a team of developers. Projects have repositories assigned to them. The project teams do work in the project's repositories. The project repositories are used to do builds. Those builds are used to create products that are distributed by the project. But in practical terms, basically, an Eclipse project conforms to the Eclipse development process and the intellectual property policy. It calls itself an Eclipse project. We have some branding requirements. So a project is Eclipse Foo, not just Foo. And actually, I noticed that on the slides today during the keynote. Everything from Red Hat is Red Hat something, Red Hat OpenShift. All the projects were, all the open source things that they were involved in were branded. Apache does this, for example, as well. So again, and we have these branding guidelines which define how we use our brand. Brand is actually a pretty big part of open source. We carefully manage project names, for example. The Eclipse Foundation holds project name trademark on behalf of the community. And that's to ensure that nobody can dominate the project, or we can avoid confusion in the marketplace by somebody using a project name in their product name. Again, that was mentioned in the keynote, which I thought was valuable because this has been part of my life for a little while. Anyway, it's important to us that an Eclipse project operate independently from any vendor, so vendor neutrality becomes a really important part of what we do. A project operating at the Eclipse Foundation is not a project for a particular company. It is an open source. Supposed to be pointing that at me? Okay, do I have to stand here? Is that? Okay, yeah, I'm going to be to the side of all the picture, all the camera. Okay, all right. Anyway, operates independently. Anyway, so it's important to us that that projects be truly open source, and we do talk a lot about a level playing field and sort of a standard set of rules that everybody plays by, regardless of who they work for. I'll talk a bit about that as we move forward. Projects at Eclipse, open source projects at the Eclipse Foundation are required to use the infrastructure that we provide for core content, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means. So the open source, the development process defines a whole bunch of interesting things like the open source rules of engagement, some governance structures. It talks about how projects relate to one another and the different people and how the different roles in the projects and how everybody is intended to interoperate. It defines things like how releases work and sets up, again, just how interaction between projects and the community occurs. It's really all about implementing the fundamental principles or the open source rules of engagement. The intellectual property due diligence process is a process that we require projects follow. The idea is intellectual property that's included in the project. Ultimately, we expect for a successful project that the content that they produce will be included in various products, both commercial and perhaps open source as well. So it's important that we make sure that intellectual property is clear of, or as clear as possible of anything that might be a legal encumbrance. So, for example, we want to make sure that content used in a project was authored by the people who say authored it. Right? We don't want people taking somebody else's code, changing the license, and including it in an Eclipse project. That could have some negative legal repercussions down the line. It's worth noting that when it comes to intellectual property due diligence, it's all about risk mitigation. There's no such thing as an elimination of risk. Trademarks, again, as I mentioned earlier, the Eclipse Foundation asserts ownership of the trademark of all Eclipse project names. This is actually a little bit confusing for people in Europe in particular. In North America, we have a notion of common law trademark where you can, based on first use, you can assert ownership of a trademark and then challenge. If somebody tries to or uses your trademark, you actually have a legal standing. In Europe, it's a little bit different. But we register some of our trademarks, but we basically assert that we own all of the names of all of the projects that we have. And this has had a few impacts over the years. We did have one point a project called Mylar, which we wound up having to change because we couldn't reasonably assert ownership of a 3M-owned registered name. Recently I had the Apache Foundation came to me and asked if they could use the name Zest, an Apache Zest project, and we said no, and they said okay. They weren't, they weren't too unhappy, but and we do the same thing. If somebody wants to make a project with a name that Apache is using, we just say no. We don't even ask Apache. We just say no and look for a new name. Anyway, we believe that there is a cycle of value. The Eclipse Foundation, the brand, having the Eclipse brand associated with the project adds value to the project. Having the project name's brand associated with the Eclipse Foundation adds value to the Eclipse Foundation. And together we rise. So source code is something that we consider core content. The project is, that is the core meaning of the project, is the source code. So all source code by an Eclipse project must go into a repository provided by the Eclipse Foundation. Denis' team is the one that provides that. We have a couple of options. You can use Git on our servers with Garrett if you choose, and we have an option to host repositories on GitHub. Something that's not really commonly known yet is we've relatively recently made a change where we actually now have the ability to do multiple organizations on GitHub. So you can have an Eclipse-foo organization for the foo project and have multiple repositories there. Or you can use the Eclipse organization and put your repo in with the 5 million repos that are there now. That's really your call. So again, this is core content and it's important to us that Eclipse Project teams work in that repository. So as you are doing work, as you are making commits, those commits need to go into the repos that are assigned to you. I was just dealing with a project relatively new. They're just coming on board, so they're still just learning the process. But on their mailing list, they were saying, you know, hey, Bob, can you take the last 4 weeks of commits that we did in our SVN server and put them into the Eclipse repo? You know, if you do that, nobody else can participate in your project, right? If I can't get to the most recent version of the code in the source repo, I have basically no chance of doing any or helping you or participating in that project, and that makes the playing field very unlevel. So I know we don't allow projects to do work behind a firewall or work over here and then move it into the Eclipse repo. The Eclipse repo is where you need to work day to day. Documentation. I consider documentation to be intellectual property on par with code in a project. Documentation is code. I know that's not true, but documentation is core content. It is first-class content that needs to be in the repo. It must be deployed on Eclipse. It must be represented in Eclipse Foundation infrastructure. You can put it somewhere else too. That's okay. So if you want to put it in read the docs or something, that's great. It can go there too, but it needs to be in Eclipse infrastructure as core content. What we need that content to persist for the entire life of the project, and it needs to be in resources that we have the ability to manage and control. Now, just another kind of side note, I don't have this on the slides. There is a provision. Projects are required to have all of their content under the project's licenses, the declared project's licenses. If you have settings files or example code, you can put that under the EDL, which is a BSD style license, right? So in general, this is not related to the slide. If you have, again, code content that's an example, the idea with examples is you actually expect people to take those examples and copy them and change them and incorporate them, make derivative works of them and use them in their products. The EPL makes that, there's some restrictions that it adds. If you do this if you have examples, put them under the EDL so people can make copies, change the license, and kind of actually use them without having all of the obligations of the Eclipse public license or the Apache license or whatnot. Anyway, if that doesn't make sense, ask me after. We can talk more about it later. Issues, bugs, tickets, whatever you choose to call them. In the Eclipse community, in the Eclipse world, we refer to all of this as just bugs, which I think makes sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to everybody else. But anyway, whatever you decide to call them, tickets, issues, bugs, they are considered core content. They contain value. They contain information about the project. They contain, about how the information about how the project has evolved. There's important and valuable information there that we feel needs to persist. That needs to go into core content. So projects must use either the GitHub issues that are part of their repos in GitHub, or our Bugzilla instance for projects. That's all that we allow. And again, I think it's a pretty good reason. Feel free to argue with me. The project dev list is also core content. All projects get a dev list. We want there's actually a requirement in the Eclipse development process that if you are a committer on a project, you need to be a member of the dev list. We don't actually currently force that to happen, but I'm thinking we should change that. We talk about this every year, and then we change our mind about every 2 years. The dev list is the primary means by which the EMO communicates with the project. I represent the EMO, so if I need to contact you, I usually go through the dev list. Interesting thing that, as part of, you've probably heard of this Jakarta work that we've been doing, bringing the Jakarta projects on board. One of the things that we stumbled into as part of this is we have no notion of private. Like, everything for us is public, right? So we have these public dev lists. There's no such thing as a private list for committers or for project leads or anything. Anyway, we ran into this very early on because a lot of the people doing Jakarta work are used to the JCP, where much of the work is public, but they have these private channels, and we just don't. So that's a little bit weird. Just brace yourself for that. You know, get used to working in public. So non-core content. So non-core content is basically everything else. One of the challenges that I have is culturally we kind of set up a framework and say, you know, kind of these are kind of the boundaries, and then we run into a lot of people who culturally need, you know, like to know yes or no answers, right? So a lot of it's a judgment call, but anyway, so generally though, basically anything that I haven't listed as core content is non-core content. And generally, it's okay for project teams to use it, subject to a couple of considerations. First off, level playing field. So anybody coming to use your project, if you decide to use some service that's not provided by the Eclipse Foundation, anybody who comes to the project needs to be able to participate. If you have some thing that you're using and it's private communication or it's proprietary or it requires some kind of special you know, payment to participate, or have to give up too much personal private information to participate, that's very difficult for some people to join in on, right? So that's very restrictive. That would be an example of something that we would not want a project to use. But if you have a service and anybody can participate, the bar for entry is relatively low, then generally it's okay. If you're not sure, send a note to emo@eclipse.org and we'll help you sort through it. But generally, when it comes to whether or not some external service can be used, it's a matter of determining if the playing field is level. Right? We just don't want it skewed so that some committers are more special than others, for whatever the reason. For non-core content, it's important to us that the keys be made safe. So this would be safe from domination, right? So if you have some service and you only have one person who is the administrator, that administrator has extraordinary power. So we would like, we need as much as is possible for that administration role to be shared and for there to be clear rules for how one becomes an administrator. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be written down. It can be an understanding. But the idea is if there is some service that you're using that is core or important to the operation of the project, and something the project team is using, we need to make sure that it survives somebody leaving the project, or somebody getting power hungry and deciding to dominate the project and take it over or whatever. We need to, again, keep the playing field level. So the keys need to be kept safe. Now, we won't keep the keys. We just don't have when I say the keys, right, the access, right, the passwords or whatnot. Like say, for example, if you have a project Twitter account, like a couple of people need to have access to that Twitter account. A couple of people need to be able to recover that account on behalf of the project. And we're not going to, we just don't have the capability of holding on to that information for the project. It's just, there's just too many different things to do. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so talk a bit about the development. So the development process defines all this. I think I meant some of this. Oh, one of the things that's actually important here. The development process is fairly high level. It talks about, basically, it sets up practices to ensure that the playing field is level, basically. Day by day development practices. Are you doing sprints? Are you following Scrum or whatever the latest thing the kids are doing today? That's really an individual project decision, and do what you think works for your community. Level playing field, right? One of the challenges, if you do sprints and those sprints are at a company location and there's no means for anybody else to participate, that's not a great way to grow community. Open source rules of engagement: transparent, open, meritocratic. Transparent and open to a lot of organizations, to a lot of people, mean the same thing. To us, they are very different. Transparent means you show people what you're doing. This takes the form of minutes put onto a public list if you have meetings. This takes the form of bugs being and issues being tracked in a public issue tracker. Decisions that are made in a corridor, between two colleagues, get copied into a public forum so that others can share in that decision and understand it and participate in it, which is the second part. Open means that you're open to other people joining the project. It needs to be, the project needs to run in such a way that if somebody shows up and they have ideas and energy, that they have an equal opportunity to participate in the project regardless of who they work for or any other consideration. This doesn't mean that every contribution that comes your way you need to accept. This just means that everybody has to play by the same set of rules. It's perfectly reasonable for a project to say we will only accept code contributions that come with tests, that come with documentation. And if someone shows up with a bunch of code and none of the other two, that's the rule. That rule should be captured somewhere. Ideally, that should be captured in a contribution guide that's sitting in your Git repo. Right? Here is the minimum bar that we require for you to contribute to the project. Meritocratic is basically earn your way in. To become a committer on a project, again, exclusive of any other considerations, if somebody is making regular contributions to your project and those contributions are being accepted and it's clear that they understand your code base, it's clear they understand what you're trying to do, and it's clear they understand our process, they should be invited to join the project as a committer. Committers have awesome powers, so we want to make sure that the people that you give committer status to are going to be a complement to the project. Now, where that bar is, like how high is the quality bar, that's really up to a project. But basically all of our PMCs, and there's some exceptional circumstances. If you try to nominate a new committer and the criteria, the nomination statement is, we just hired Jody and she's a great developer and we need to have her on the project, not good enough. We actually ran into this ourselves. The Eclipse Foundation actually has, in the past anyway, we had a project that it was a website was actually run as an Eclipse project at one point. And whenever we bring on a new staff member to work on the website, I remember one time we tried to say, let's get this guy his access, and it was like, stop. Yeah, you got to run an election, and before we can do that, we need to know that he's going to make good quality contributions. So we make our own staff do this. Anyway, consistency is important. Vendor neutrality should be one of the things. I think I've talked a lot about this, and in the interest of trying to actually make my time limit, I'm going to move on this one. 3 communities. Most projects have some portion of these communities. All of our projects have a developer community. That's your committers and your contributors. Talk a bit more about them in a minute. Most of our Eclipse projects are building frameworks and platforms and content that's intended to be included in products. So the adopters are the people who would be taking that content and including it in their products, including it in their offerings. Perhaps educators who are doing education based on that content. Those are your adopters. Relatively small community by comparison to, say, the user community. The user community be your end users. The Eclipse project is probably an obvious example of this. The Eclipse project has a massive user community measured in the millions, and that user community, for the most part, the Eclipse IDE is a product that they use. They don't care about open source, they don't care about our code names, they don't care about our projects, they don't care about any of that. All they care about is the Java thing or the C++ thing that they need to build, or the PHP thing. Okay, I gotta be careful here. We do have all sorts of things, but they've got a job to do and they want to use the Eclipse IDE to do it. Now, of that massive user community, there's a much smaller community of companies that take the products of the Eclipse project and the eGit project and the CDT project and the PHP PDT project and all those, and they bundle them together and they put some of their own content in there and they make a product called something else. So it's a company product. Those are your adopters. Now, big user community drives people to want to use your product in their your content in their product, which grows your adopter community. From your adopter community is where you start to get contributors. So having a lot of users is good because you then get a lot of adopters. You have a lot of adopters, that's good, because then you start getting contributions because people are incorporating your stuff into their products. They care about what you're doing, and they will get involved in one way or another. At least some subset of them will. So each of these communities feeds into the next. Writing code is fun. So again, given all this, that they've got this community, writing code is fun, but you actually do need to also spend some time interacting. So I mentioned earlier, capturing decisions in public forums is an important part of this. Actually responding to user questions or adopter questions in the forums that you support. Actually having a website that tells people how to get started, right? So open source projects need to invest time and energy in making sure that people who want to participate have a fighting chance of doing so. We often refer to the expression that we hear used a lot is kill with kindness. If somebody does show up to your project, it's important that you make them feel like they're welcome. If their contribution needs some work, it's important that you spend some time and energy meeting them and helping them to whip their contribution into a shape that you can accept it as part of the code base. Again, it's all about growing community, growing diversity in the project, and ensuring that the project will persist. We have a history. There's a bunch of projects. The most successful projects are the ones with the greatest level of diversity. The projects that fail are the ones where we have one vendor, couple of committers, and then the vendor decides we don't care anymore. And then the project is gone. All your hard work has disappeared. So who's who? In an Eclipse project, we have the PMC. The PMC are an oversight body. Every project has a PMC that's assigned to their top-level project. PMC provides governance, oversight, best practices. Some of them are more engaged than others. Some PMCs actually work with projects to ensure their architectural, basically develop an architecture or a stack of the products that they produce. Many of the PMCs are a little bit more, have a much more diverse portfolio, and it's difficult to do that. The technology PMC in particular doesn't take an interest in how projects fit together because that's just not in their charter. Contributors will issue your pull requests, or they'll get Garrett review requests, and your committers are the ones who have the actual access to push to your Git repository, resolve issues, and otherwise basically affect change directly in the project. We need committers to take contributions from contributors and turn them into value and put them into the repo. One of the things that you'll see is there's actually no direct connection between an organization or a company and a project. The relationship with a company is completely indirect. As an organization may employ a committer, may employ contributors, that is how an organization impacts or can influence a project, is by actually putting people onto the project and having those people contribute. Project leadership. Project leads are the first layer of project leadership. Project management committee comes over that, and then the EMO. The EMO is the Eclipse management organization. I got a chuckle out of this from my teenage son when I talked about emo. But anyway, the EMO, as EMO, we have overall responsibility to manage the process and make sure that projects are progressing. My role in it, I consider my role to make projects successful, projects and committers, successful. I represent the EMO. I'm the entry point to the EMO. But the EMO itself, and this was news to a couple of long-term committers. The EMO is actually the combination of our architecture council, our planning council, the Eclipse Foundation staff, all together. And then I am the face of that. Then we have the executive director, who I take direction from, and he grants me certain abilities to act on his behalf as well. So this project leadership chain becomes important because we have some power to enact change. Basically, we have a nuclear option. If something is bad is happening in a project, we can shut it down We can we can remove committers if we have to, but we would do only with cause, and we have to make sure that that cause is well captured. And we can add committers if that's necessary. But we have certain powers as defined in the Eclipse development process. So working as a committer, as I said before, committers have full write access to project resources, including the download server, builds. They are the ones that have the ability to do the real work. Contributors are, again, an important part of this process. Their contributions must actually be accepted by a committer. They are required to sign the Eclipse Contributor Agreement. Intellectual property, as I mentioned earlier, is extremely important to us. Anybody who contributes to an Eclipse project, we need to make sure that their contributions are free, or again, mitigate the risk of legal implications with their contributions. So if somebody is contributing to an Eclipse project, we need to have confidence that they wrote the code, they have the permission to contribute the code under the terms of the project license, and they need to be aware that all their contributions are public. This has a GDPR implication, right? If you, there is no means by which we can accept an anonymous contribution. If you contribute to an Eclipse project, we need to keep track of that, and we track it publicly. Additionally, contributors must sign off on each commit. There's a link there to the Eclipse Contributor Agreement. When we receive a contribution via Git, the author field must have the email address of the contributor as was used when the Eclipse Contributor Agreement was signed. We also need the signed off by to use the same email address. The author field is, or the author name is not actually, it should be, anyway, it's generally ignored, but there's options. Whether the format of the actual comment is something that the project team may have some input into. In the footer at the bottom, there's also an ability to say if multiple people worked on something, you can do also by entries to indicate, or to give credit to others that may have helped you with some work. We actually have hooks on our Gerrit and Git repositories and on GitHub that check for this. So if you have a project on GitHub and someone gives you a contribution, you will get a warning if there's no ECA on file. If that's the case, then you need to circle back with that individual and make sure that they sign the ECA. If you have a problem with that, or if there's a something, if someone says they have an ECA but the bug or the hook is telling you otherwise, contact us and we'll help you sort it out. Due diligence process is captured in a poster, which is extremely scary. I'm not going to show you, but the short version is, the poster just makes it look way harder than it is. The short version is any third-party content used by a project needs to be vetted by our IP team. So here I have an Eclipse project using some third-party content. That third-party content uses some third-party content itself. The IP team needs to vet all of this. The initial contribution, the initial drop for the project needs to also be vetted by the Eclipse IP team. And they're looking for basically proof, again, that the people who say wrote the code actually wrote the code, had the necessary rights to contribute it, and then otherwise basically mitigate the risk of adopting that code. The way I tend to think about it is any content that is inflicted on the consumer, the adopter, or the end user needs to be vetted by the IP team. In the interests of time, I'm going to move past attempting to say works with. We'll get that later. This is all captured in the handbook. If you go to eclipse.org/projects/handbook, all this information is there. In the interests of time, I'm going to power through this and talk a little bit about releases. To do a release, we expect projects to do some development. They produce some number of milestone builds, right? So milestone builds are intended for an audience bigger than the developers themselves, but smaller than the user community, to vet your work and provide feedback. Some number of milestones should be done during a development cycle. At some point, a release candidate is delivered. The project will engage in a release review and then push out a release. The release review, which I'll try and get to quickly. We're changing this a little bit. We're introducing the notion of a progress review. This should become true in December is our hope. For a year following a progress review, a project can do any number of releases that they choose without further ceremony. The releases must contain, all of the content in the release must be resolved by the IP team though. We must actually make that the IP rules still apply. The idea is that we will just review the project periodically to make sure you're doing the right sorts of things. This is something that we need. A lot of projects, certainly runtime projects, are releasing very, very frequently. We added this, I'm going to go over 30 more seconds. We added this because in order to do a review, we need to have some documentation that describes the review, and we need to actually look at your intellectual property log. We actually maintain most of the information in an intellectual property log on your behalf. So this is actually relatively easy, but it still takes some time to assemble that, and a review takes a minimum of a week because we want the community to have a chance to weigh in. Theoretically, a member of the Eclipse Foundation can say no and stop a review. That has never happened, but theoretically. Anyway, but this whole process should take, to do a review, we plan on taking chronologically about 2 weeks. Probably about 30 minutes of your actual time though. Right? Shouldn't take too much time to assemble all this. By reducing this burden, by introducing this progress review, we're hopeful that project teams will use more time to build things like release notes and new and noteworthy documents, which are of real value to the community. So with that, I think I'm actually out of time. I just want to show you briefly, every project has a committer, a page in what we call the project management interface, or the PMI. If you go to your project page, this is the URL will look something like this. There's a bunch of stuff that committers can do. If you are a committer, a bunch of stuff shows up. So doing elections, creating records, a request for third-party, for intellectual property review by the IP team, generate IP logs, other sorts of things. So there's all sorts of information there. So with that, I'm actually going to, well, I guess I kind of got there. There's all sorts of other things that you need to know. The handbook is a great source of this information. Again, it's eclipse.org/projects/handbook. Basically, we've taken all of our documentation and put it in one place, and hopefully that becomes a useful resource for everybody. With that, I'm going to end. I thank you for your attention. Thank you for your charity coming to attend this talk, and, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.